Hey, welcome back, faithful politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching us on our YouTube channel, we're glad to have you. I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Burtram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing well, thanks.
And this week, we have with us Dr. Ashley Boggan. She is the General Secretary of the General Commission on Archives and History for the United Methodist Church. In this role, she ensures that the UMC understands its past in order to envision a more equitable future for all Methodists. Dr. Boggan's earned her PhD from Drew Theological School's Graduate Division of Religion, specializing in both Methodist, Wesleyan studies. That's not a word I say all the time. and women's gender studies, and she earned her master's from the University of Chicago's Divinity School. So welcome to our program, Ashley.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk religion and politics, two of the taboo subjects out there.
Yes.
You know what's interesting, Ashley, is that I actually went for a year to Drew Theological Seminary, to the
Really?
school there. Yeah, I did.
Oh,
Right there in
wonderful.
Madison, New Jersey.
Yeah, that's
So
where
that
I'm coming live from. So,
That's well. So tell me, how does one become the living library of Methodist history, and how did that lead you to give a bobblehead to the Pope?
ooh, I mean, that's quite the bookends there. So, I got into this role. I have always been a huge history geek. Both of my parents were ordained clergy within the United Methodist Church, and I never felt a call to the ministry, but I felt a call to history geekdom, and
nice.
with the United Methodist upbringing that I had, as I learned more about Methodist history, I just found myself asking more and more questions because our history is quite wonderful and crazy and cool and so different from the United Methodism that I was kind of raised in. And so I just had all of these questions. And so it led me to the PhD. Out of the PhD, I was a professor at an AME Zion seminary in North Carolina, and then a professor of women and gender studies at a small liberal arts college in North Carolina. And while in those positions, I still had kind of my fingertips in the United Methodist history world, and heard that this position was open and reached out to a few colleagues and former colleagues, and was lucky enough to be accepted and offered the position. The first laywoman to have the job, first woman, first person, I think, under the age of 60. To be
Nice.
Oh,
So it's been wonderful. And how that led me to the Pope, through this job, I get the wonderful privilege to travel a lot and speak about Methodist and Wesleyan heritage to a variety of people. One of those trips took me to the European Methodist Historical Society convocation, which was last August, I believe, in Rome, Italy, where we have an ecumenical officer who's stationed in Rome and arranged for a variety of ecumenical meetings between us and the Roman Catholic Church. And one of those were that we were special guests of Pope Francis. And we didn't know it was going to happen until it was happening, that we would actually get to shake his hand. We weren't allowed to bring anything with us into the area, except I brought in my bobblehead. It goes with me everywhere. And I gave it to him. He immediately looked at it and laughed and said, John Wesley. And I was like, yes, my favorite pope.
that's amazing. Wait, is that a bobblehead behind you? Is that like the same one?
It is. So I keep a number of these on hand to give out, especially, well, they usually travel with me to do fun TikToks and things like that. I was doing a fun TikTok when I decided to hand it to the Pope, and let him keep it. And so I had to replace him.
That is pretty
Nice.
phenomenal, I gotta say. I mean, out of the stories of how I met the Pope and things I did with the Pope, that's up there. I mean, I've only talked to one other person who's met the Pope. We had James Martin. I forgot what his official title was, but
Yes.
he had some pretty fun Pope stories that we can't repeat here. But but I'm curious about like just the Methodist Church in general. So we'll get into some other topics as it as it pertains to the Methodist Church, but like, what is the Methodist Church? Like, what separates it maybe from some other denominations, and has the Methodist Church always been united?
Okay. So we go back to John Wesley, who was a priest within the Church of England living in the 18th century. In his role, he was really out to kind of create a renewal movement within the Church of England. So his main critique of 18th century Anglicanism was that persons kind of went to church on Sunday morning and then didn't do a whole lot outside of going to church on Sunday morning. And so he set out to renew the Anglican Church towards mission and towards ministry with those most outcast. And he did this in a number of ways across, I mean, he lived a very long time for someone in the 18th century. So he did this in a lot of different ways through founding schools and orphanages, creating different preaching houses that served as medical dispensaries, as libraries, as spaces and places for people to come together. And the thing that made him and his movement distinctive was that he really created this method of living out your faith. And that method involves not only kind of your personal acts that you do to strengthen your relationship with God, like prayer, fasting, studying the scriptures, but also what we call social holiness or social acts, which strengthen your relationship with your neighbor. And that is in those acts of mercy and charity of visiting the sick and the imprisoned. And when Wesley was doing this during the 18th century, he was harassed and outcast by the church and by the state as being a dissenter, as being heretical, because it was just such a foreign concept to go and pray with those who are in prison. Like, why would you do that? And their kind of mindset. And so I always like to say that Methodists are known as kind of the weird religious people who do things like show acts of love to those who society outcasts.
That's heresy. What are you doing?
I know, right? Like, no one in the Bible did that. I can't think of anyone, hint Jesus, who was outcast for showing love to the outcast.
Yeah, just point of clarification. So the name Methodist literally comes from just having a method. Because like my mind is blown right now. I for some reason I thought there was some sort of deeper spiritual, theological, I don't know, like something.
So the name was actually a derisive connotation. So it was a way of making fun of this group. So John Wesley begins kind of these small groups at Oxford University, and they were called the Holy Club, kind of as poking fun at them, Bible Moths, Sacramentarians, and then finally they were called Methodists for their methodical way of doing religion. And it took Wesley a while to claim the word Methodist as a positive identifier, because everywhere it was thrown around as like, look at these Methodists, like, ugh.
And we kind of almost like the charismaniacs, you know, where you call people charismaniacs, but I'm not sure if that's gonna stick necessarily. Maybe we can try to figure that. What was the other one? There's charismaniacs, but what was the? There's a cartoon called the something maniacs. Anyway, it'll come to me again. Animaniacs. Bam, right there. So I'm not sure if it has the same flair though. So one of the big things, right, that is in the news right now with the Methodist Church is, of course, this new ruling that has come down regarding the United Methodist Church's stance on LGBTQ issues. Mm-hmm. Could you kind of help us understand the history kind of leading up to this moment, and then what was actually even decided at this? Because I'm sure there's a lot of misunderstanding, you know, people just reading headlines and things like that. So help us kind of understand.
Yeah. So we just concluded what is called General Conference. Methodists are really good at conferencing. It is both a geographical term and a temporal term and a gathering term for us. So we call everything conference. So we just had General Conference, which is our legislative gathering that happens every 4 years. What was unique about this one is we were supposed to gather in May of 2020, but, you know, kind of the world shut down in early 2020. And so this was the postponed 2020 General Conference happening in 2024. And so we had not met for 8 years as a worldwide church. And a lot's changed in 8 years. A lot has changed since 2016. And one of those, I guess, benefits is that it did kind of give some space for the Holy Spirit to come in and do some breathing amongst United Methodists, because we did change a whole lot at this General Conference session. But so some of the history of building up to what happened in the last couple of weeks, which I'll get to in a little bit. So in 1968 is when the United Methodist Church is formed. So we have a history, our mother denomination is the Methodist Episcopal Church. It is formed out of John Wesley, kind of after the American Revolution. It's officially formed in 1784. Fast forward to 1968, there were a whole lot of splits and mergers, and you get the founding of the United Methodist Church. Now, it was founded in May of 1968, which I believe was a couple of weeks after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., was in the middle of the Vietnam War. I mean, there was just this massive amount of social unrest. And two denominations came together, the Evangelical United Brethren and the Methodist Church. And they merged together. And in this merger, they tried to find a way to speak to their understanding of religion's place within society and kind of how to take certain social stances in the midst of a rapidly changing American landscape. And so what they ended up doing was they created a task force. We also love creating task force in the United Methodist Church, a task force or a study committee to study the social principles. And so we looked at documents that each of the denominations had that talked about things like healthcare, birth, death, marriage, sexuality, gun violence, civil rights, environmental positions, just about anything that there is a social issue or social understanding on. United Methodists began to look at that and figure out, what are we as this newly created denomination going to say about this? And that document came back in 1972. And one of the paragraphs that was written was on human sexuality, right? Think back to like 1940s and then 1970 and how much sexuality changed within the American landscape in the 30 years. And the United Methodist Church wrote this rather radical, affirming stance, and I guess a couple of paragraphs on sexuality as a good gift from God, as something where all persons are created in sacred worth and have sacred value, and about how we should love our bodies and use our bodies to express the love of God. And it, in the last paragraph, really kind of affirmed the emerging homosexual community, which, now we call the LGBTQ plus community, but back then the language that was used was the homosexual community. And so this comes out in 1972, and I think the study committee had done a lot of research and listening to experts on sexuality and marriage and gender. And so they felt like it was a very kind of apt statement. But I think the General Conference, who was not so used to studying and hearing experts, was a little taken aback by how kind of blatant and affirming and radical it was. So the way things happen at General Conference, a little bit of polity for you here, certain reports are presented to the plenary. And the plenary in 1972 would have been about 1,000 people. And so 1,000 people are hearing this document for the first time, and 1,000 people are reacting to it and having questions about it. So just imagine the sheer chaos that breaks out. So there are lots of questions. We follow Robert's Rules of Order. So there are amendments, points of order, points of clarification, amendments to amendments, substitutions to amendments. What ends up happening after about 8 hours of debate on this one paragraph is a clause is added to the end that essentially says, although we do not condone the practice of homosexuality and consider it incompatible with Christian teaching, that line came to be called the incompatibility clause. And over the next 52 years, different bans were added based on that incompatibility clause. So we had a ban on using denominational funds to support LGBTQ plus advocacy. We had a ban on LGBTQ persons being ordained. We had a ban on same-sex weddings and same-gender weddings. And then all of those became chargeable offenses. And if you came out as a LGBTQ plus person and were a clergy person, you could be defrocked. Or if you did a same-sex wedding, you could be defrocked. So that's kind of your 52-year summation of
I love that word, by the way, defrocked. We need to start using that more, Will,
can you
in our
define
vocabulary.
defrock? That's a term I'm not familiar with at
Yeah,
all.
so it's essentially strips you of your ordination credentials. So you lose your license or you lose your ordination. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is so wild. I'm number one. I'm just like soaking it in because like I don't know. Like I didn't grow up in the church. I mean, I spent better part of my early life as an atheist, and came to the faith in 2008 because I married a PK and like she brainwashed me, But no, I'm just kidding. But I am curious though about like. On what were the biblical incompatibilities that sort of prompted the commission or whoever to really kind of come down hard on the Methodist stance on LGBTQ issues?
So I would say, according to some theologians, I don't necessarily agree with all these theologians, but there are 6 verses in scripture, and I'm not going to be able to name them off the top of my head, that are generally called the clobber verses, is what they're referred to. And I think that's because they're usually used to clobber LGBTQ persons over the head with the Bible.
Clobber.
Clobber. I've also heard them called the cluster verses. So there's a whole lot of different phrases that you can use to describe these, but it's pieces from Romans and Leviticus that all talk about kind of same-sex relationships. I want to put an asterisk though on same-sex relationships, because what scripture is actually talking about is kind of same-sex acts, not necessarily relationships. And that's one of those spaces where our 21st understanding of sexuality is so different from sexuality in the Roman days. In the Roman days, it was all about power. Consent was not a thing. The person doing the penetrative act had the power, and it didn't matter if you were male, female, male, adult, child, consenting, not consenting.
Yeah.
So trying to kind of take scriptures and books that were written for very specific contexts and times and questions, and using them to legalize things within our 21st century context is where we've gotten a bit astray. So it's really hard to take kind of a black and white understanding of sexuality in the Bible and apply it to now. I mean, the Bible condones polygamy. The Bible condones rape. The Bible condones violence against your wife as long as it's no larger than your thumb, right? And so there's all of these aspects that we no longer see as good or appropriate things within any relationship, yet alone a loving relationship. But we've picked up on same-sex acts and have kind of morphed them into our modern lingo in order to other them or weaponize or demonize them.
Yeah, I heard. Sorry, Josh. I heard somebody once say that if we truly advocated for like biblical type of marriages, then there would be a lot more divorces in our country because of just about everything that you just mentioned.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. This has been such a difficult issue for so many churches and denominations that have had to wrestle through this. right? The culture is shifting. There's no doubt about that. And people's views have already shifted in many ways and are continuing to shift. And the church has to kind of figure out what things are, what they really, believe about this, and trying to figure out which things, like what principles are there and what things are culturally contextualized within all of those verses that you have. And I took the liberty to look them up. I don't have them off the top of my head, but Genesis 19, that's Sodom and Gomorrah. Leviticus 18:22 talks about not lying with males with a woman. Leviticus 20:13, Romans 1:26 through 27. 1 Corinthians 6:9-10, and 1 Timothy 1:9-10. So people can go look those up if they want to. And that sounds about right? But make sure you look them up in context. That's very important. And you always read in context. Go ahead. You can respond to that.
Of really interesting exegetical studies out there right now, written by conservative, progressive, and even LGBTQ clergy persons or lay persons that look at those verses and really wrestle with
Absolutely.
them. And they do a beautiful job at doing that. And, one of the things I want to kind of add, Josh, that when you were speaking, it kind of came to my mind is John Wesley in the 1732. He had just graduated Oxford, and he was kind of in the beginnings of forming Methodism. This is a story that kind of gets to that first use of the word Methodist, Will, that you asked about earlier. And so he's doing this prison ministry in Oxford and is going to the Bocardo, which is, I think, the prison either right inside the Oxford walls or right outside. It's one of those. And he visits a certain inmate there named Thomas Blair. And Thomas Blair was imprisoned for having a same-sex relationship with another man. And John Wesley takes a special interest in his case because Thomas Blair lets Wesley know that he's being further victimized because of his crime. And Wesley brings in some lawyer friends. They make sure that the evidence is handled properly in his case. And at no point kind of in the conversations and the ministry that he had with Thomas Blair, was he ever calling him sinful or condemning what he did. He was just trying to make sure that his humanity was being protected and that his case was going to be properly handled. And so for me, when we get the question a lot, especially in my role, of how would John Wesley have felt about conversations around LGBTQ persons today? And I always tell that story as a response. It's like, he'd be kind of irked that we've spent 52 years arguing over whether or not to love people and arguing over how other people love other people. Like, his main thing was just love people. And it doesn't matter how they express their love in a consensual fashion with another person. As long as you ensure that their humanity is protected and that they feel the worthiness of God in them and through them, then you're good and they're good.
Yeah, no, I've been through my own journey on this. I have a brother-in-law who's married to his husband, and I love both of them very deeply, care for them. I have no doubt that God loves them. My views have not necessarily shifted in terms of, what I think that the biblical witness is about it personally. And I'm always open to new, evidence. Before, I was not open at all. To be honest with you, I really didn't have any interest in trying to learn about the other side. And it took connecting with people very, very different than I was, thinking very differently than I was. And then this personal experience of my own brother-in-law, and now even other people within, my circles of influence and friends. And relationships really do change you, right? They really do make you think. And so I wouldn't say that I've changed my mind and sense of like, what is the biblical witness? But what I'm wrestling with now in that progress, like in my own progress, is what do we do with the biblical witness and how do we minister effectively today, staying faithful to Scripture, contextualizing it. I'm a very, I believe currently still, I say still because I know so many people have gone in different areas, but I still believe in inerrancy. I still believe in infallibility, and I still believe, at least at a large level, in the authority of Scripture to guide my faith, to guide my moral life. And I'm curious for you as to what has been the kind of what's been your journey on this. You had two parents that were ministers, right? I'm sure that they heavily influenced you, one way or the other, or even just helped you think, right, on and how to think. What was that like? Kind of help us understand kind of where you were and where you are, as comfortable as you are in sharing all that, and then how that evolution has taken place in your own life, especially with your extensive knowledge of the history of this movement that you're a part of.
Ooh, so yes, I was raised by two United Methodist ministers. They were, I would say they were pretty progressive for being white middle class ministers in the South. So I grew up in Arkansas. And we were progressive in that we didn't really talk about sexuality, right? So it's one of those things, if you don't talk about it, you can kind of do whatever.
Right.
Good old Southernisms, I guess. And so I remember like very vividly when I began studying Methodist history and someone showed me this book called the Book of Discipline, and that's where like our social principles are. It's our law book. And it's horribly named, but it's just our law book. And as I was flipping through it, I found the paragraph on sexuality, and it was the first time that I read the incompatibility clause. And I remember calling my dad and being so mad at him for I felt like I'd been lied to. I felt like I was raised in what I thought was a very accepting, affirming place and space, and all of a sudden there's this language on paper, and the more and more I dug into it, the more I learned about the different bans and how we don't do same-sex weddings and all of this, and my world kind of came crumbling down in my very privileged position. It did, but I think in order to rebuild my faith is when I began really studying Methodist history. I've always processed things by asking questions and oftentimes asking too many questions. And so you could really say that moment and that kind of faith crushing moment led me to where I am now. It led me to the PhD, led me to being a professor, to a very deep love and appreciation of our Wesleyan heritage and the hope that it can bring to us. I also, in my research and my questioning, I got really irritated with the way United Methodists talked about sexuality, because really our incompatibility clause and all of the debates around sexuality are really talking about sexual orientation. But we like to say human sexuality as if it's all of our human sexuality is defined by our sexual orientation. And that began to really irk me. So my dissertation, which became my first book, really looked at how have Methodists talked about sexuality, broadly speaking. So I went back to John Wesley, and he was determined to be celibate his entire life, but ended up marrying a woman, but they never had children, and they had kind of an awful, abusive marriage. And then Methodists start talking about sexuality kind of after the Civil War, alongside the Comstock laws and the first kind of birth control movement and fights for abortion's access and reproductive rights. And then we start talking about divorce and sex ed in the 1960s. And then by the 1970s, we're talking about sexual orientation. And so I looked at how we talk about all of these different aspects of our sexuality in order to critique that so often we think we're talking about human sexuality when actually we're talking about a very small aspect, which is our sexual orientation.
That's really fascinating. And you know what I love the most just about kind of the Christian faith. And I'm still relatively a novice, came to the faith in 2008. Is that, and doing this podcast has really kind of helped me appreciate it even more, because we've spoken to a number of different people from different walks of life. We spoke to a trans bishop, and we spoke to, like other people of color, that Native Americans, that are all part of this Christian family. And if you just look at sort of the lineage, the history, like none of these people should have ever thought that Christianity was an attractive religion for them. So I'm always just like, I always feel very passionate when folks that have really been pushed like to the side by Christianity have embraced it, and have really focused on love. And I want to ask you, like, and then we'll get into more of the details about the commission and the meeting that took place. Is like, what are sort of the biblical bases for affirming LGBTQ plus community and lifestyle, what have you?
I would say kind of what I always focus on, and I'm not a biblical scholar, so you'll have to forgive that.
It's okay.
But what I tend to focus on is, the great commandments to love God with your whole heart, soul, and mind, love neighbor as self. And the love neighbor as self part is one of those that I really like to nuance a little bit, because in order to love your neighbor, you have to love yourself. And so often when it comes to our LGBTQ plus siblings, different interpretations of Christianity tell them that they aren't worthy of self-love, that they have to change in order to be worthy of self-love. And so how do you love yourself the way that God made you, so that you can live into that great commandment of loving God and loving neighbor? So I think that's one of those aspects. Also, Jesus never really talked about marriage or sexuality, broadly speaking. He talked a little bit about divorce, but we're all okay with divorce because, but the whole tenor for me of the Gospels is about finding ways of spreading God's love to those who society pushes to the extremes and the boundaries. And for me, that's one of the messages that can carry through the last 2,000 years of history, right? Because since scripture and the Bible was written for a certain context, it's really hard to pick out certain things because our context has changed so much. But an overarching theme is that Christians go to those who are most outcast and bring them in and have their backs. So how has that happened throughout history? And I think in today's society, one of those spaces, not the only space for sure, but one of those spaces is with our LGBTQ plus siblings. And so as society pushes them further and further out, and we're seeing this increasingly so state by state within the United States, how can we as Christians, how can we as United Methodists literally have their back and help hold them in and hold them together, and do so by using our privilege and our place and our witness to do that. And that's one of those things where, with the Thomas Blair and the John Wesley story, that's what John Wesley was doing. He had Blair's back. He's not condoning or condemning his actions. He just has his back. And that's what we need to do.
I really love that. And as a podcast that have that we had Lucian Greaves on, the co-founder of the Satanic Temple, on our program. I can tell you there was a lot of mixed reactions from our audience. Some, and maybe even like close family members, perhaps. but he was a great guy, and at the very end, Josh makes fun of me all the time because like I wished him well and wished that his ministry like flourished or something like that. I was like, I don't know. I was nervous. Okay. I reacted, and my reaction was just to be graceful and show love, so, but I want to get into, the actual convention, where, it's sort of the nexus of why we wanted to have you on the show. So like, take us into the room You had already mentioned everybody hasn't met in, several years. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of other agenda items that were discussed. So kind of take us into the room up into the point that the discussion about LGBTQ type issues were brought up.
So I think in order to fully get across how this conference was so different, I want to contrast it a little bit with 2016 if I can. So in 2016, it was my first time attending General Conference. And there and at the two prior General Conferences, the discussion of human sexuality was tabled because people were scared that we were going to divide as a church. So you're like, okay, it's here. Let's not talk about it. And let's try to move on and pretend like, we didn't just table that. In 2016, that happened in a different way, and that a study commission was formed to once again study human sexuality. This was the 6th study commission we'd formed to study human sexuality, by the way. And that brought their legislation back in 2019, which made a lot of more punitive actions. So in the past, the discussions of human sexuality had been incredibly tense, harmful for all persons involved, but especially our LGBTQ siblings. And it was a space where everybody came guarded, and you could almost feel like the Holy Spirit sucked out of the room. This General Conference was so different, and it was relaxed. I think people on the first day were anxious. Like I was eating Tums like they were candy. But once things started going, like I think everybody kind of, you could feel like collective sighs and like people like stretching, like, okay, I can have a more relaxed posture. And the way that things began to pass was a sign that this General Conference was going to be different. And that's because big legislation that was removing our historic bans, both on funding and on ordination, passed on the consent calendar. And so, little polity lesson for how a conference works. So it's a 10-day meeting. The first 5 days are legislative committees. So there are 13 legislative committees. We get thousands of petitions. Those petitions are divided amongst those committees. Those committees deal with the petitions, they perfect them, they pass them, or they decide to reject them. The things that are passed are all gathered onto a consent calendar, and then the consent calendar comes before the full plenary for 24 hours, and you can get 10 to 20 signatures to pull something off of the consent calendar if you want to talk about it as a whole group. So the language that was removed, or the petitions to remove all aspects of the harmful language, sat on consent calendar for 24 hours and no one pulled it off. And so then the next morning it passed along with like dozens of other pieces of legislation by a single vote. By a wide margin, but one vote passes the consent calendar. And so it's one of those places where like you're sitting there and you're like, okay, is this really happening? Like it's still on consent calendar, and everyone's like triple checking their daily Christian advocates, which is our journal, kind of to see like, am I missing something? We're like checking with other people, like you still see this here, right? And then it passes and it's like, okay, we just did that. And I think the funding ban was the first one to pass on consent calendar. And there's a visitor section, and then there's the bar of the plenary. And we've been ingrained as delegates to not react to votes or to speeches. But the visitors always react, which is wonderful. And so you just start to hear like this eruption of clapping and screaming from the visitor section. And one of our rules, because we have so many lovely rules as United Methodists, is that you can ask for a point of privilege to have a moment of prayer after significant legislation. And so a delegate got up and said, I feel like we need to mark that this just happened through a moment of prayer. And so we had that prayer after the funding ban. We had it after the ban on ordination was lifted. Again, like that was another moment where there was just I mean, you could hear weeping from people who had been fighting against this ban for the last 40 years. And right after that consent calendar was passed, the plenary took a break, and United Methodist always erupt in song. And so we started singing Draw the Circle Wide and other songs, which that was particularly moving because those songs at previous general conferences were sung as protest. You know, draw the circle wide, draw it wider still. All about, you know, drawing that circle of God's love wider and wider and wider, and how big can we get it? And they were sung in protest to say, you know, we're called to draw the circle wide and y'all are making it smaller. And this was the first time where, as a worldwide gathering, we sang the songs in praise, not in protest.
Right.
And like, oh my God, you could not contain anyone's tears. Like it was, it was so moving. And then it kept getting removed on consent calendar. And the only space where it was really talked about on the floor was when it came to the new language in the new revised social principles, where we were defining marriage. And there, the discussion was really rather short. It wasn't harmful. And we ended up having two definitions of marriage. And one names it as between an adult man and adult woman, and another names it as between two consenting adult persons. And like, it was like, we can hold both of these in order to appeal to both progressives and conservatives, to the US, in our worldwide delegates, in our worldwide membership, and be okay with having that. And like, it really was just an amazing experience. And after 2016 General Conference, I really struggled with whether or not I was going to stay United Methodist. You know, I fought with that hard, as a lot of people have over the last 50-something years. But after this General Conference, I am so flippin' excited to be United Methodist, and to have been there and just experience. I mean, the last day of worship, we did a conga line to Love Train for like 20 minutes. And that never would have happened. I mean, bishops came off the dais, like everybody was joined hand in hand. We were all just singing and dancing to Love Train. Like, it was so different.
Wait, did somebody have Love Train queued? I mean, it seems like it would be too random.
So whoever did the worship planning for that day went with it, and it was so good. Yeah. So we have video of it, and that will definitely be archived because it's monumental.
Yeah, that's one for the archives, huh?
Yes.
You know, it's funny because as I'm sitting here listening, like I feel this tension inside, because on one hand, I'm like, man, that sounds so cool. It sounds like it was a historic moment to be a part of, and I love that. And I think the tension that I'm feeling inside is that I'm imagining if I was United Methodist, you know, how I would be feeling. Because I have pretty conservative values, like in the sense, not that people don't, maybe values isn't the right word, but it's a certain definition of conservatism, which I still think that the marriage that God sees as holy before him is between a man and a woman. And I don't see like sexual expression out of that as necessarily legitimate. But, you know, those are personal convictions that I have. And again, like I said earlier, I'm much more open to hearing like the arguments and knowing where people are, and trying to just, you know, we have to figure out how to love and how to bring the gospel in a way that makes sense to people. And if all they felt is hate from the church, how can they feel the love of the gospel? And so that very much resonates in my heart in having the personal experiences that I've had. But I guess I'm wondering and thinking about the more conservative people like me. I'm assuming that you have those people within the United Methodist Church. And I'm assuming that they are trying to figure out now the same question you were asking yourself in 2016, they may be asking themselves now, right? Can I stay in the United Methodist Church now that it has, you know, made this decision. And I guess what is like what kind like what do you foresee? And I know as a historian, I know that like predicting the future is a very scary thing to try to do, and no one wants to stake their claims on some prediction. But how do you see this kind of playing out? And were there any provisions? I know you said those two definitions of marriage. Were there any other provisions or any other discussions or anything else that came, like where there's an indication, essentially, like what do you think the impact this is gonna be for the more conservative? Again, just using American classical
Yeah.
right now, conservative versus liberal, the more conservative, not factions, but delegates and constituents within the movement.
Honestly, kind of after the hype and the headlines die down, I don't know if there will be that much change for your average conservative person sitting in a pew on a Sunday. And the primary reason is because we didn't vote for any affirming language to be included. All we did was remove the prohibitive language. So,
Gotcha.
If, one of the spaces where that may have a direct impact on a conservative person sitting in a pew is now their clergy person can come out and be who they are if they are an LGBTQ person who'd been hiding in the closet.
Right.
And that is a space where, there might be some wrestling. But I know a lot of people have very deep respect and connections with their pastoral leadership. And so I hope that they would be able to see through and see around, a person's sexual orientation or gender identity in order and still have that loving, respectful, affirming relationship with them. But kind of on paper, all we did was remove the prohibitive language and restrictive language. We didn't add anything affirming, which there were petitions to add affirming language that were voted down, even by progressives and like progressives of the extreme left, because we didn't want to alienate and our more conservative persons. We didn't want to lose more members. We want to create a space where truly people can feel welcomed, no matter their beliefs. And United Methodist, we always say that we're a big tent denomination, able to hold together a lot of different political understandings or political perspectives and theological understandings. And so like Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren, and Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney and George Bush, all United Methodists, right? And you think about how they kind of understand faith and politics in this world. And I could keep going. Willie Nelson and Beyonce, United Methodists. The names of persons who are United Methodists are quite wonderful and varied. And so, I really do hope that kind of once the headlines change a little bit, that there won't be that much day-to-day change for most people. And that's both a good and a bad thing, I think. I personally, as a historian, I look back at we have a particularly racist past as a United Methodist Church. We had a segregated jurisdictional system where all Black Methodists were put into a race-based jurisdiction so that a Black preacher could not be assigned to a white congregation. And it's kind of the same parallels, right? Where the way that we'd been operating as a gay preacher wouldn't be assigned to a congregation that wouldn't accept them. And a lot of the work that we've been doing, we dissolved that jurisdiction in 1968 on paper, but that doesn't mean that we got rid of racism within the system and within persons and communities. And so we've had to hold ourselves accountable and have constant conversations and do education around how does racism show up within churches, within our structure, within our theology, within our relationships. And how do we, as people of God and people of Christ and followers of Wesley, approach that and deal with that and hold ourselves accountable for that? And I hope that we'll now have the ability to do the same when it comes to our LGBTQ siblings. We have done harm. We might not all agree that we've done harm or as to what kind of harm we've done, but there has to be some sort of space for educational resources to be developed, for congregations to go through processes if they want to do so, for annual conferences to provide those resources and that support, and for general agencies to document the history. Prior to this funding ban being restricted, I could not use denominational dollars to overtly collect LGBTQ histories. We had been, but it had not been an overt thing. And now we're able to open a center for United Methodist LGBTQ heritage. And it's going to sit right alongside our African American Methodist Heritage Center. So for me, I hope personally and professionally that this begins a conversation of accountability and education. But also, I do think for your average person in the pews, they probably will not see a lot of change unless they go to a church that was on one of the extremes.
I'm curious, like what's been the immediate impact of this change? I mean, are you seeing rise? I mean, in our current climate, church attendance is abysmal. It's been going down, pretty significantly over the past 25 years. So, have you seen an increase in memberships? I don't know. Talk to us about what the impact has been so far.
I mean, I would say we're too close to the conclusion to really see the long-term impacts. And there's so much other things that have gone on in the last 6 years. I mean, COVID drastically declined church membership that was already declining, and we are just now figuring out how to account for online worship and all of this stuff. So I think before we look at membership numbers, we'll need some time to pass. But I also am a very strong proponent of not focusing on numbers, but focusing on mission. And I think focusing on numbers leads to a narrative of decline, whereas focusing on mission actually kind of energizes people. And
that's good.
May have a correlative effect of increasing membership, but even if it doesn't, at least you're still focusing on doing good in the world. So, I would say the immediate impact that I've seen has been on our mission. And there's a great example that I want to point out. So one of the pastors who was defrocked, right, or had her credentials taken, was Beth Stroud. She served in the Eastern Pennsylvania Conference of the United Methodist Church. And she came out to her congregation in 2003 and had her credentials removed in 2004. This past week at the Eastern Pennsylvania annual conference, when I say this past week, I mean 2 days ago, she was reinstated as a clergy person in full standing. And the video, seeing her put her clergy stole back on for the first time, is so moving. And seeing people welcome her. And Eastern Pennsylvania is not exactly a predominantly progressive conference, but they knew that harm had been done and that she does have the gifts and graces and a call from God. And she also had stayed United Methodist after having her credentials taken. She's been a United Methodist historian. She's been teaching United Methodist classes. And so she stayed devoted to the denomination that did her harm because of its mission in the world. She knew it was greater than this current iteration of Methodism was making it to be. And so to honor that and reinstate her is so moving. And in our ordination process, when you're ordained, you kneel before a bishop, and the bishop lays hands on you and kind of ordains you. And when she was reinstated, the bishop, Bishop John Scholl, knelt before her and had her lay hands on him of kind of hands of accountability and forgiveness. And I mean, I'm going to get teary just thinking about it. But, it's moments like that where we are seeing healing being done. We are seeing accountability beginning. It's going to take a lot of work. There's a lot of healing that has to be done. But I think that's hopeful. And so if we can continue to focus on mission and community and just putting the love of God out there, I don't really care what the numbers are. And I say that as a person who definitely has financial budgets that depend on membership numbers and all of that stuff. But, numbers are what they're going to be. The mission is what matters.
Yeah, I really appreciate that sentiment, and I agree with that. It is the mission that matters the most, and the concentration on numbers leads to all sorts of hijacked incentives that have differing effects depending on the culture of the denomination.
Mhm.
But it is an absolutely real thing that
Mhm.
has those kinds of incentive structures with it. And so I really appreciate you saying that. This is my last question for you. What is the role of historians like yourself moving forward within the Methodist Church and even broader within the movement of Christianity in America? Um, where do you see historians the role, and how like what they can do to help us learn about our past so that we can make good decisions about our future?
Um, so I'll give a couple different answers, and one will be kind of a serious one, and one will be kind of a not so serious one, I guess. The serious one, I do think that our role as historians is to hold ourselves accountable to our past, and to tell the full story, right? So many historians, especially when you work for organizations that do rely on like growing and increasing funding and membership, we like to tell the really happy, good stories that make people warm and fuzzy. Because then, if we make people warm and fuzzy, they might, join or give money. But that's not the full story, right? That's a very censored story. It's often a very white, male, heteronormative story. For me, telling the full story is where historians need to step in. We need to be um, telling the ways that we've done harm, holding ourselves accountable to that, uplifting the stories of minority groups that we've either oppressed or distanced or othered in some way, and highlighting the varied experience of, at least in my case, United Methodism, not only within the US, but around the world. The kind of not a serious story is, we also, um, in my role, I often get told that people like following me on social media or paying attention to what I do because I'm just fun. I do goofy things like give the Pope a bobblehead, right? I have this cutout of John Wesley behind me that I took to a youth event, and me and John Wesley walked around the entire event together and like went on a walk on the beach and like shared a latte and watched a rom-com and like, but there's a good balance there between telling the full story, talking about harm done, and trying to be fun and creative and energizing with history and catching people's attention. Because a lot of people think history is really boring and that's stuff in the past and it doesn't matter. But if you catch their attention and make them see how it is relevant, for me, that is incredibly vital. And, I often will read from John Wesley's sermons or tracts that he wrote in the 1740s, 1750s, without really necessarily saying that I'm quoting him, because I think if you do that, a lot of people are like, that's a weird way to say that, but I see the relevance there. And then you tell them that you're quoting, and they can kind of, it brings history to a certain moment, and it can really show how history is constantly speaking to us and can really be a tool to help us craft our future.
Wow, that's beautiful. Um, and the fact that you would walk around with a cutout of John Wesley means that like you're my people. So, um, well, because of this change is still kind of new. If somebody's listening to this and maybe they have wanted to join a church, we're a little nervous, maybe that they are part of the LGBTQ plus community, and want to get plugged into a faith, like how can people learn more about the Methodist Church, everything you folks are doing, and how can they plug into just what you're doing?
So I would say if they want to know kind of broadly about the United Methodist Church, there's a great website called umc.org. right? United Methodist Church, UMC.
Mm-hmm.
There you can kind of learn about our beliefs, our history. There's a lot of engaging videos and resources. There's a Find a Church button where you can find a local congregation. I would also recommend reconcilingministriesnetwork.org. That is our LGBTQ affirming caucus group. And if you're looking for a congregation that is not only welcoming, but overtly affirming of LGBTQ plus persons, they have great resources there as well. They've just done a new Vacation Bible School study that is absolutely wonderful. They also have a Find a Church button as well. And I would also say following the General Commission on Archives and History on Facebook or Instagram might be a weird thing that you think would be fun and engaging, but I promise we are. So, I have to do a plug for my own agency, but umc.org and reconcilingministriesnetwork.org I would highly recommend.
That's awesome. Well, Ashley, thank you so much for your time. This has been a blast.
Yeah, thank you.
Learned a lot. And I really hope that our listeners would check out those websites that she mentioned. I'll make sure I put a link to it in the show notes as well. So, well, that's it. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. And remember, keep your conversations not right, not left, but up. And we'll see you next time. Take care.